When my dad first mentioned giving me his old car, I thought he finally saw me as the reliable one in the family. For once, it felt like all the hours I had spent juggling school, part-time jobs, and helping at home were actually being noticed. I was 25, still finishing up classes at the community college in Nashville, working nights at a grocery store. Life wasn't glamorous, but I managed. My younger brother, Josh, on the other hand, had just turned 21 and floated through things. He dropped classes, switched jobs every other month, and somehow charmed his way out of every mess he made. That was always the pattern. I took responsibility, he took chances. So when Dad casually told me over dinner, "I'll hand you the Camry when I get the new truck," I almost laughed in relief. That car wasn't fancy. It had dents on the passenger door, and the check engine light came on at random. But to me it meant freedom. No more waiting for buses in the Tennessee heat. No more begging coworkers for rides after closing shifts. I let myself believe things were finally shifting in my favor. For a few weeks, that promise became the thing that kept me going. I started planning my budget differently, thinking about weekend trips I could finally take without worrying about bus schedules. Even little stuff, like being able to pick up groceries on my own time instead of walking them home, felt like a new level of independence was just around the corner. I didn't bring it up much to Josh, partly because I didn't want to rub it in, and partly because I didn't want to jinx it, but deep down, I could feel something I hadn't in a long time. Hope that my dad wasn't always blind to the difference between us. The night Dad picked up his new truck, I was the one who drove him to the dealership. He traded in his old Ford and came out grinning like a kid, patting the shiny hood as if it were a trophy. On the way home, he talked about towing capacity and gas mileage while I tried not to think about the Camry sitting in the driveway, waiting for me. It felt like a small victory I'd earned without asking. When we got back, Josh was sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, yelling into his headset at some online game. Dad tossed him the keys to the new truck just to let him check it out, and Josh jumped up like Christmas had come early. I reminded myself that wasn't the truck I wanted, and Dad had already promised me the Camry. A couple days later, I asked Dad when we could handle the paperwork. He brushed it off, saying, "We'll get to it. Car's still insured under me, so no rush." It stung a little, but I figured he just wasn't in a hurry. Meanwhile, I kept waiting for that moment when it would officially be mine. Then one Saturday morning, I walked outside and saw the Camry wasn't in the driveway. I thought maybe Dad had taken it to run errands, but when I came back from work that night, it still wasn't there. The next day, Josh pulled up in it, window down, blasting music, waving at a couple friends in the passenger seats. My stomach dropped. I asked Dad about it later, trying to keep my voice even. He barely looked up from the game on TV and said, "Oh, I told Josh he could use it. He's got more places to be than you right now." The words hit harder than I expected. Like all those years of doing the right thing didn't matter at all. I wanted to believe it was temporary. Maybe Dad just meant Josh could borrow it for a week or two until he figured out something else. But days kept passing, and the Camry never came back to the driveway. Every time I saw Josh behind the wheel, usually with a different friend in the passenger seat, it felt like the promise Dad made me was fading into thin air. One evening, I confronted him again. I told him I'd been counting on that car, that I'd adjusted my budget because he'd promised it. He sighed like I was being dramatic and said, "You're older. You can handle yourself better than Josh can. He needs a leg up." That sentence stuck with me for days. Handle myself? Wasn't that the point? I'd been handling myself all along. What I needed wasn't another reminder of responsibility. I needed a break. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was the pattern replaying itself. Josh messed up, and somehow that became my problem to absorb. He dropped out of classes, and I had to pick up extra shifts because Dad was covering his tuition. He lost jobs, and I loaned him money that never came back. Now he got the car that was supposed to help me move forward. If you've ever been the dependable one in your family, you know what it feels like. Everyone applauds your resilience, but behind that applause is an expectation. You'll keep figuring it out while someone else gets the support you quietly needed. It's like being punished for being steady. That week, standing at the bus stop in the August heat, sweat running down my back, I made a quiet decision. If I wanted independence, I couldn't wait for Dad to finally recognize my effort. I'd have to build it myself, no matter how unfair it felt. I started running numbers on a notebook between classes and shifts. My savings weren't much, just a couple hundred stashed away after paying tuition and rent on my small apartment. But once I faced the reality that the Camry was gone for good, the math didn't feel optional anymore. Every late bus, every awkward ride request from coworkers was fuel for determination. Meanwhile, Josh drove around like the Camry had always been his. He even left fast food wrappers in the back seat when he parked it at the house. Dad didn't say a word. When I mentioned it, he shrugged. "He's young. Let him have some freedom." That phrase burned. Freedom was exactly what I was trying to earn, and somehow it made me the selfish one for wanting it. So I started picking up more hours, closing shifts, weekends, even volunteering for last-minute call-ins. It wasn't glamorous, my feet ached, and I came home too tired to cook most nights. But with each paycheck, I tucked away a little more. Slowly, the savings started to build. I also researched cheap used cars online, Craigslist, local Facebook groups, shady little lots with handwritten signs. Most of what I found looked like it would fall apart on the interstate, but I kept scrolling, kept imagining that moment I wouldn't have to check bus schedules anymore. There's something about chasing your own solution when you've been overlooked. It stings at first, but eventually it turns into a kind of fuel. I realized I was done waiting for my dad to notice the difference between me and Josh. The only person who was going to change things for me was me. By September, I had saved just over $1,000. Not much in the grand scheme of car prices, but enough to start looking seriously. I didn't tell Dad or Josh what I was doing. It wasn't out of secrecy so much as self-preservation. I didn't want to give them a chance to dismiss the idea or talk me out of it. At work, one of my coworkers, Angie, overheard me browsing listings on Break. She leaned over and said her cousin flipped cars on the side. Nothing fancy, just old sedans and pickups he fixed up cheap. She gave me his number, and by the end of the week, I was standing in a gravel lot behind a mechanic's shop, looking at a beat-up Honda Civic. It wasn't pretty, dull paint, a missing hubcap, and the faint smell of cigarettes inside, but the engine sounded strong, and the price was within reach. Angie's cousin even agreed to let me pay part upfront and the rest in 2 installments. I walked away that day with the keys in my hand and paperwork that actually had my name on it. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd taken control. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, Dad looked surprised. "Where'd that come from?" he asked, nodding at the Civic. I told him I'd bought it myself. He gave a half smile and said, "Good for you. Shows initiative." I wanted to laugh at how neatly that brushed past the broken promise, but I didn't. Josh came out a minute later, leaned against the Camry, and smirked. "Guess we're both car owners now." I didn't bother correcting him. The difference was clear enough. One of us had something handed over. The other had earned it, mile by mile, shift by shift. Driving that Civic changed everything for me, even if it was old and rough around the edges. Suddenly, errands weren't a chore I had to plan around public transit. I could stay late after class, accept last-minute shifts, even make weekend trips without checking bus schedules. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and that mattered more than anything. Of course, owning it came with new headaches. The first month, I had to replace the brake pads, and a warning light flickered on for something I didn't understand. I spent evenings Googling repair videos and learning just enough to keep the car alive. It wasn't easy, but each problem I solved felt like proof that I could manage on my own without waiting for anyone's permission. Meanwhile, Josh was living the opposite reality. The Camry was already showing wear from the way he drove it. Loud music, sudden stops, and a revolving door of passengers. Once, I noticed a dent in the rear bumper that hadn't been there before, but when I asked him about it, he laughed and said, "Don't worry, Dad won't care." And he was right. Dad didn't mention it at all. If you've ever been the responsible one, you know how twisted that can feel. You carry every small weight, while someone else drops theirs and gets applause for trying. Watching Josh treat that car like a toy made the bitterness rise in me again, but instead of letting it crush me, I channeled it into something different. I started setting bigger goals. The Civic was step one, but it didn't have to be the end. For the first time, I thought about building towards something that couldn't be taken away or promised and then handed to someone else. By winter, the Civic had become more than just transportation. It was a symbol of the fact that I could provide for myself, even when the people closest to me didn't come through. I started to notice how much calmer I felt behind the wheel, even during Nashville traffic. That little car gave me the kind of independence I had been craving for years. Meanwhile, Dad and Josh kept circling the same loop. Josh pushed boundaries, Dad excused him, and I quietly carried on. At family dinners, Dad would still brag about how Josh was finding his way, even though I knew half his gas money came from Dad's wallet. When I mentioned balancing work and school, the response was always, "That's good, you've always been responsible." It sounded like praise, but underneath, it felt like dismissal. There's a strange pressure that comes with being labeled dependable. People stop asking what you need, because they assume you've already figured it out. They mistake survival for stability, forgetting that even the strong ones need support sometimes. I used to wait for my dad to realize that, to finally see the gap between what I gave and what I got back. But driving home one night after a long shift, I realized I didn't care as much anymore. Because here's the thing, once you stop waiting for fairness, you start creating your own terms. I no longer measured my progress against Josh or the promises my dad broke. Instead, I asked myself what I wanted my life to look like next year, or 5 years from now. That shift in mindset was subtle, but it felt like taking the wheel for the first time, literally and figuratively. Still, part of me couldn't ignore the growing cracks in Dad's favoritism. The Camry was falling apart under Josh's neglect, and I knew eventually that problem would circle back to Dad. I just wondered if, when it did, he'd notice the difference between how each of us had handled what we were given. The cracks started showing faster than I expected. By early spring, Josh's friends were joking about how his ride rattled every time they hit a pothole. One night, he came home fuming because the Camry had overheated on the side of the interstate. Dad rushed outside with him, popped the hood, and tried to make sense of it, but the truth was obvious. The car hadn't been taken care of. I stayed inside, listening from the porch. Part of me wanted to gloat, to point out that I'd been ready to maintain that car, that it would have lasted me years. But another part of me felt tired. It was the same pattern repeating. Josh breaking something, Dad trying to patch it together, and me watching from the sidelines. A few days later, Dad asked if I could give Josh a ride to work since his car was down for a bit. I hesitated, not because I couldn't do it, but because of what it meant. For years, I had been the backup plan, the safety net. Saying yes would keep the cycle alive. Saying no would finally draw a line. I told Dad I couldn't, that I had my own shifts, my own schedule, and that Josh would need to figure it out. That answer surprised even me. There was no argument, no long justification, just a clear boundary. Dad looked disappointed, but I didn't bend. Josh ended up borrowing rides from his friends, the same ones who cheered him on when the Camry still ran. If you've ever drawn that first boundary with family, you know how heavy it feels. It's not rebellion. It's choosing not to carry a weight that isn't yours anymore. Driving off in my Civic that day, I felt both guilty and relieved. Guilty because I knew Dad still hoped I'd pick up the slack. Relieved because, for once, I didn't. That was the moment I realized independence wasn't just about owning a car. It was about deciding whose problems I was willing to make my own. The weeks that followed were quieter, at least for me. Josh scrambled for rides, sometimes late to work, sometimes skipping shifts altogether. Dad grew more frustrated but rarely said it out loud. I could sense the tension building in the house every time I visited. Meanwhile, my Civic kept humming along, thanks to the routine care I gave it. Oil changes, tire rotations, even cleaning out the crumbs in the back seat. It wasn't just maintenance, it was proof to myself that I could handle what I worked for. One night, Dad called me out of the blue. His tone was softer than usual. He asked how my classes were going, if the car was holding up, and then, almost as an afterthought, he admitted he might have misjudged things with the Camry. He didn't say sorry directly, but it was as close as I'd ever heard. I didn't push it. Some parents can't spit out an apology word for word, but you learn to hear it between the lines. Still, the call left me thinking. For years, I had chased that kind of acknowledgement, hoping Dad would finally treat me and Josh equally. And now that it came, even in that half-hearted form, it didn't feel like the victory I imagined. I didn't need his validation to know my worth anymore. I had built it, paycheck by paycheck, mile by mile. There's a strange freedom in that realization. Once you stop waiting for fairness, you stop being chained to disappointment. Josh could keep spinning his wheels, Dad could keep making excuses, but I didn't have to orbit their choices anymore. I had my own direction. The next morning, as I drove to class with the windows rolled down, I caught myself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because the road ahead finally felt like it belonged to me. By the time summer rolled around, the Civic and I had logged hundreds of miles together. Trips to campus, late-night drives home from work, even a weekend visit to a friend in Knoxville. It had become my steady companion. Each time I turned the key, I was reminded that this car wasn't handed to me. It was something I built for myself out of grit and persistence. Josh eventually abandoned the Camry altogether. After too many breakdowns and too little effort to fix them, it sat in the driveway collecting dust. Dad finally admitted it wasn't worth repairing and had it towed off for scrap. Watching that car disappear down the street should have stung, considering what it represented, but instead, I felt oddly detached. The promise was gone long before the car was. What mattered was the shift inside me. I no longer compared myself to my brother, no longer kept score of who got what. I had spent years measuring fairness, but the truth is, fairness never really came. What came instead was resilience, and that was something no one could take away. Sometimes life gives you the short end, and you're left staring at an empty driveway while someone else cruises off in what you were promised. But if you've ever been in that spot, you know the secret. Waiting for recognition is a trap. Building your own path, however rough, is where the real freedom lies. When I parked the Civic one evening and shut off the engine, I sat there for a minute in the quiet. I realized I wasn't bitter anymore. I was proud. Proud of the long shifts, the cramped bus rides, the frustration that pushed me to save every dollar. Because in the end, I didn't just earn a car, I earned the right to steer my life on my own terms.